I'm Hope Palmer Bramhall. My father was Colonel Palmer, who was the one of the last commanding officers of Fort Williams. And I have obviously, being an Army brat, my father was a West Point graduate and who really wanted to go to MIT. And when he was given the appointment to West Point, he said, oh, I have to take that. But since he graduated from West Point, they sent him to MIT, which was great. Anyway, I lived in 15 places before I went to college. And the only place that we ever returned to was Cape Elizabeth. I went to Cottage Farm School when I was in kindergarten and first grades, came back in 7th and 8th grades, and Dad was then commanding officer of the Harbor Defenses of Portland. And then he came back one more time when I was in college. And between my sophomore and junior years, he came back and he was again commanding officer of Fort Williams, this time commanding officer of the Maine Military District. When he was commanding officer of the Harbor Defenses of Portland, it was immediately post-war. And so then when he came back the next time, by being commanding officer of the Maine Military District, it showed how much the military in Maine had shrunk. So he now was in charge of all the military in Maine.
And siblings you had?
And I had two brothers, and one of whom you're going to be talking to tomorrow, I believe. And Terry lives in Florida, and my other brother, Paul, lives in California.
Thank you.
So,
Sally.
Hi, I'm Sally Horne Hinckley, and my father was in the 5th Infantry stationed at Fort Williams when he met my mother. My mother's father, my grandfather, Nelson Baker, was the chef at the officers' mess in Cape Elizabeth at Fort Williams, and he introduced my father and mother. And about a month later, they got married.
Oh, wow.
My great aunt Sadie was the pastry chef at Fort Williams in the officers' mess. And we lived across the street in Charlie Farr's house after I was born, after they got married, and then I was born. So my connection with the fort comes after my connection with Fort Popham. And I did go to some schools here. I went to Cottage Farm School for a while. Then we'd go someplace. My father would be transferred somewhere else. And then we'd come back. And this went on until 6th grade. And then about the time, I think it was May when I was in the 6th grade, there was one more month of school. And we came back and that was it. So I graduated from Cape Elizabeth High School in 1955. So my connection with the fort isn't just my father, it's my grandfather, my great aunt as well. And so the fort was my little town, my little city. Went to the movies here, went to everything was at the fort, except for one thing. I didn't know there was a lighthouse.
You didn't what?
I didn't know there was a
We'll
lighthouse.
get into that.
I knew there was a lighthouse.
Oh, a lighthouse.
I knew
You
there
didn't
was.
know that?
No, I didn't. We never went near the lighthouse. We spent all our
That's gonna be
time
one of my
doing other
questions
things,
later.
skating on the pond, swimming, whatever.
Al, how about yourself?
Well, my personal background is I was born in Fort Williams. I lived in the mansion. Yep. And my father was Master Sargeant, 5th Infantry. And I recall a lot of things about Fort Williams, swimming on the beach down there. That was a sandy beach then.
Right.
And a great place for kids to swim. I remember my father putting me in the guardhouse because there was rolling cannonballs down the street. They caught me doing that. They called my father and they said, what do you want us to do? And they put him in the brig. So I ended up in the brig as a kid. I remember the parades on the parade grounds.
Yes.
The movie theater.
Were you from the area anyway? Well, you were born in Fort Williams, obviously. Have you lived there?
In the area?
In the area your whole life?
I've lived in several places in Portland.
Okay.
I've lived in Westbrook for probably, 70 years or something like that. served on city council over there and several other things. And
Yep.
I went to Cottage Friends also back when, and I graduated from Westbrook High School in 1948. And
So obviously you were in Cape Elizabeth from the age 0 to how long? How old?
I'd say probably 8 years.
8 years? Yeah.
Yeah. Then the 5th Infantry was transferred to the Panama Canal,
Right.
Panama Canal.
When World War II.
And my father went there, and my mother and my brother's sister stayed here. And eventually lived up near my grandfather in Westbrook. And on from there, I went in the Air Force and did this and that, and became a teacher and taught at Deering High, Portland High. Then I went to Scarborough, and I'm teaching shop. That's
Are
where
you?
I started teaching. And one day, the superintendent of schools and the chairman of the school board walked into my shop. And I've got kids running machinery and all that. And I thought to myself, what are they doing here? But we chatted for a minute, and they said, have you heard that the principal's retiring? I said, I heard that. Good luck to him. They said, do you take over? That was my interview.
Okay.
I did that for 15 years.
Wow.
Enjoyed almost every minute of it.
Almost.
Sure.
Got some great stories that, being a
course.
principal has to do. I'd probably be in jail if I was a principal today,
Oh, you would.
because things have changed so much.
Oh, they got.
We'd all be.
No, I have some great memories of Fort Williams. Like I say,
Well, hopefully we'll get to hear those. And Sally, you were also a young girl when you were living near Fort Williams.
Yes, but my memory of Fort Williams started immediately. I think when I was born, I'm sure my mother came right over to see her father on almost
Sure.
on a daily basis.
Yep.
She was very connected to her dad. And so I was always going to the fort, even when I didn't live on Shore Road in Charlie Farr's house.
what year did you go back and forth to the fort?
From the time I was born.
What year was that?
That's impolite, but
No,
No,
19, not at our age.
I want to see what the
No.
connection is here.
1937.
37.
Yeah,
So you started going over the fort about the time I left.
that's why we never met.
Oh, son of a gun. Too bad.
I know. Well, we meet now.
Yeah.
So that was my grandfather was the big draw because he was the chef. He had the food, the pies, and I was eventually that little girl who would be told to go into the officer's mess and say certain things to the commanding officer in there that my grandfather told me to say, for which he would give me a nickel.
oh,
It would be called child abuse today, but I loved every minute of it. Don't forget, my grandfather was a civilian employee.
yeah.
So he could say what he wanted. He didn't have to fear the colonel or the general. Whatever.
You had several stops at Fort Williams.
Yes.
Very young age, a young girl, and then a college age.
Right. My first stop was at Fort Preble when I was
Right.
in kindergarten and first grade,
Okay.
and then we came back. But my parents built a cottage in Raymond at Crescent Lake,
Okay.
and so that was a place. That was an anchor to windward for us. It was a place when we were able and close enough. We could come back in the summer, and my mother and my brothers and I could stay there for the whole summer, and my father would get to have a month off to visit, so which was wonderful. But it was when I was in 7th and 8th grades that we came back to Fort Williams, and Dad was then commanding officer of of the Harbor Defenses of Portland, and so I went to school here, and I reconnected with friends that I'd had in kindergarten and first grade, and which is very special because when you live a nomadic life the way I did and the way you did, Sally, you make friends and then you leave and you never see them again.
I never saw any other children at Fort Williams. Just one little girl who had a zoo, and I thought I was it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the same was true for me.
But you had.
My friends were all living in Cape Elizabeth,
Okay.
going to the schools.
They weren't on base.
But they weren't on the fort.
Okay.
Although,
So they did come over and skate.
oh,
Yeah.
They all came over. They all came over and said, "Love to come to Fort Williams."
Yeah, right.
Because back then you couldn't get on Fort Williams if you didn't know somebody. There was a guard at the gate.
There was a guard, but he knew my mother and he knew me, so
Yeah.
we just
Yep.
walked
Right.
in whenever we
Now
felt
you
like
had
it.
siblings, Al,
Yes, I have a brother and a sister.
and you lived at the fort, right?
We all lived at the fort.
At the fort.
In the Goddard Mansion.
Yeah.
And that was very special.
Was it drafting?
The guy, I always thought, gee, the non-commissioned officers have the most beautiful place.
Well, I think you drive
On the
in there
fort.
and you think that has to be the commanding officer.
Yeah.
I know.
Quarters, and it
And
wasn't.
you really did.
Now, how much
Really.
of the Goddard Mansion was your family living in?
One unit, I believe it was on the second floor.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Matter of fact, I have a memory there. I don't have memory because I was just a baby. The Goddard Mansion was, of course, quite big, made all of granite and what have you. And the rooms all had a windowsill about that wide, which was stone. And they had steam heat in that building. And they big radiators. You know,
Yeah, we had radiators,
You had
too.
the different pieces to put together. Well, one day I told by my mother, I rolled over and rolled off that, and my face went right in between those radiator things.
Oh.
So I had for a long time, I had these scars right down each side of my face where that radiator burned in. Pretty well gone now, but yeah, we lived right there, and the non-commissioned officers club was a part of that building
Yes, it was.
down the lower
That's
right-hand
right.
side.
Yep.
And so we always had people going in, back and forth there. It was for a kid, it was a great place to deal
Well,
with.
grew up.
A lot of fun, and of course, I can remember as a kid them firing off those artillery guns
Yep.
to protect the coast, and they would be practicing with them. They actually never used those guns for anything against any particular
Anyway.
enemy, because the submarines were going back and forth on the coast.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when they put those artillery guns, and the submarines stopped going back and forth. And I wish they'd been able to leave one of those, because those barrels were that big around.
That's a dream of
I
mine.
agree with you.
That's a dream of mine.
Yeah.
Someday, I went online and looked at military sites and surplus and seeing if any of those guns are still. They're not. They were all destroyed and dismantled. But just to have a replica or something to show the size
Right.
of those things. Those things are huge.
They were, but we couldn't really go near them.
Oh, yes.
Well, that's why we would look for them at Popham Beach. My mother and I would
Yeah.
stay up at night and get the binoculars out, look into the ocean, looking for enemy submarines.
Of course, back then, Casco Bay was a site for a lot of our U.S. naval ships. They would go into Casco Bay for anchorage. And of course, when they went out for duty or whatever, they
Yeah.
came out through by Portland Headlight.
Yeah.
And that's, as I say, the German submarines were going back and forth the coast. They was thinking they might get one. But
Have either of you read the book Casco Deception?
Casco
Deception?
Deception?
Yes.
No. I'd like to.
Fabulous book, and it's all about the Germans and
Is it on the internet, do you know?
I don't know.
Probably Amazon.
I do have a copy of it.
You do? Huh?
Yes, I do. But yes,
Were there areas of the fort where you, Sally alluded to that you went,
absolutely. That we couldn't go.
that you couldn't go?
Absolutely. But number one, you can't go into any of the gun emplacements. And living there, my friends used to love to come over, and the first thing they wanted to do was go and explore. And you couldn't do a lot of exploring. We used to go down to the lighthouse.
Yeah.
And but right on our property, we lived. I think this was when we were, when I was in 7th and 8th grades, and I can remember there was an entrance to one of the underground,
Caissons.
and it was open, and it was right off the property. We lived in that first huge house at the end of Officers Row, nearest to the lighthouse.
The house thing.
And so we had 7 bathrooms in that house.
This was a single family house.
It's a single family house. My mother never had any help. She did all the cleaning, everything herself. Huge dining room table. And underneath the dining room table, at the head of the table, there was a little button on the floor for you to push for your help to come and serve you when you were having dinner parties. Well, my mother had lots of dinner parties and no help. And I can remember having going when they would have parties at the house for all the officers and any visiting dignitaries and so forth. And so it was really fun. My brothers and I would sit on the stairs. The front door was here, and to the left the stairway went up, and then it went up again. And so we would sit there on the stairs at night and watch these people come in, and they all came in and they put their calling cards in a little bowl on the table in the front hall, and then they'd move into the living room. But what they didn't do, which is very unusual in the Army, is my parents were teetotalers.
Oh.
And so there was never a cocktail party at my house. They served non-alcoholic beverages. And so, but they usually the party included dinner.
What?
And so dinner, which my mother would have prepared herself. And I can remember using butter paddles and rolling butter in with the butter paddles, which made little ridges on the butter. And you could do that ahead of time. So
you had butter.
But then we had butter. During World War II, we didn't. We had margarine, and you just. Yeah. But I was living in Texas at that point. But anyway,
when did you live in the house that you were just describing? What year?
Twice. I lived there.
What year?
Okay, I lived at. Daddy was commanding officer of Fort Williams. Commanding officer between June of 1946 and June of 1948.
Yeah.
Oh, that was late.
That was when I'm talking about, we actually, a friend of mine came to visit, and we actually went into that open door, and we got caught.
You put in the guardhouse?
Yeah.
No, I didn't go in that. We didn't get very far into that door, but it was wide open, and we thought, gee, let's go see what's going on in here.
What open doors are for?
Yeah, right. And then he came back in 1953, in April of 1953. At this point, I was a sophomore in college. And so, and I went to Colby College, which is in Maine. So I wasn't too far away. And that was when you were in the service and you get moved from pillar to post. Why they kind of asked him, he was going to retire when he came this last time. And so they asked him what his wish was, and you get your death wish if they can give it to you. And as it turned out, the commanding officer of Fort Williams was about to rotate, and so he asked for Fort Williams again and got it. Oh. And that's when he became commanding officer of the harbor defenses, and that was in 1940.
In 1953, how much was going on in Fort Williams?
Not as much as had been when I was there before.
It was pretty dead.
No, and it was in the throes of closing down, and that's why he was commanding officer of the entire military in Maine.
At that time, it was pretty much administrative and logistics.
Right.
There were no.
But when I was there in 7th and 8th grades, as commanding officer of the harbor defenses, he used to go out and inspect all the military establishments on the islands. And one of the favorite things that I remember, he used to come back with a huge crate of lobsters. And my mother would get this, we had a 6-burner stove in our big kitchen. And so my mother they would get a big kettle from the mess hall. And my mother would cook all the lobsters. And then my brothers and I would take them to everybody on the officers' row. Everybody got lobsters. And even our cat, Topsy, got her own lobster. And she was amazed.
Now, you mentioned it, but I forgot it. What was the earliest years that your father was commanding officer? The earliest?
The earliest years were in 46 to 48.
Yeah.
And then we were there from 53 to 54, and he retired in 54.
Well, when you were first there,
yes,
did they have the parades, the band?
Oh, everything. Yeah, everything. Yeah, okay. When I was there back in those years, yes. Yeah. I can remember if you were driving on the post and it was at the end of the day. The music started playing. You jumped out of your car and saluted that flag. It was just, and if you were playing, you stopped dead in your tracks.
Very military, yeah.
Very military. But I can remember in the summertime when the bakery was baking their breads and so forth, my mother would say, "Run down to the bakery and get me such and such." Well, when you got back with the hot bread, it didn't last very long.
Yeah.
So you were.
It was so good.
Yeah.
Wasn't my grandfather's bread.
No, because he was in the mess hall. This was the bakery.
The officers' mess kitchen, one of the two buildings at a.
Now you were on and off base quite a bit, Sally.
Yeah, I was.
What was the security like back then? What did it
It
take?
was not. We was free to come and go as.
Is there any you had for the sign in or anything?
No. We used to bring peanut butter sandwiches to the guards,
No.
which they didn't want. But no, there wasn't any security that I was aware of. I'm sure there was, but I wasn't aware of anything.
Well, they
being
knew who you
off
were
limits.
too.
Yeah, they knew
Yeah.
who we were.
That makes a difference.
But we wandered around, and I spent a great deal of time at the NCO club playing with slot machines when I was little. Machines? They had slot machines.
Yes.
They had
Now we have.
they had drinks. They had everything that you'd find in a small
Where
town.
did they have that? Which
She said
I
at the
don't
NC,
know which-
non-com, or was it the officers?
sounds like it was
No, my
non-commissioned.
father was an officer. He was an NCO.
Yeah.
It was the non-coms.
Was
I
it in the
think-
Goddard Mansion?
I don't know,
The
but it
big-
had a big bar, wooden bar, and the soldiers would lift me up and put me up on the
I
bar.
bet it was in
And
the.
there would
It
be,
would have been in the Goddard
Yeah.
Mansion.
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
it?
It
And there would
was.
be 3 or 4 slot
Yeah.
machines,
Yes.
and they'd give me
That's
money,
where it was.
and I'd pull
Yep.
the.
So describe for me a typical summer day at Fort
Fort
Williams.
Williams.
At Fort Williams.
We'd go to the beach,
Okay.
but also we would go to Cape Cottage Beach, which was
Casino Beach.
the Casino Beach, which was a nicer beach really than the one
Yeah.
at Fort Williams. And that's where I would see all my friends, because my friends really couldn't come unless I invited them in droves. I couldn't see all my friends at the Fort Williams beach.
Yep.
So I spent, as a matter of fact, when we came back to Fort Williams when I was in high school, when I was in college, sorry, I was at the beach in the summertime, and I hadn't reconnected with anybody. And this is the only place in my entire life that I ever reconnected with anybody. And it's very special. And so I was on the beach, and I met my good friend, Nancy Sellers, who lived on Glen Avenue.
Oh.
And we started out
Neighborhood.
in kindergarten together and 10 Glen. And so anyway, all our friends came, and one of them was Charlie Whittier, who grew up in Cape Elizabeth. His father was the CEO of Hannaford for years.
Okay.
And so Charlie came up to me and he said, "Hope, I understand, I know you." And I said, "Yes, you do, but I guess you've forgotten." And I tried to remind him. And so I got home, and a day later I got a phone call from Charlie, and he said, "My mother tells me I really did know you, and would you like to go out on a date?"
Oh, not good. Oh, funny.
So, and Charlie and I still laugh about that with Charlie. And I did go to his 80th birthday a year ago. And he just lost his wife just before Christmas,
Yep.
which was sad. That was in the newspaper.
Oh,
But anyway, we would play games. We would do things on Fort Williams, but I like to go off of Fort Williams to have my fun.
Casino Beach was where it was.
And
Yeah.
it really was. And so that's what we would do mostly in the summertime.
Yeah.
And
so
we'd
that was
go
the
to
high red.
movies.
That was the high red beach. I went to Cliff House.
It wasn't then. It wasn't the heck. Yeah, I went to Cliff House Beach too. They call it a beach. But
Well, it wasn't a very
There was a
big
beach at low tide.
Well, yeah. And then if you started walking those rocks and
Yeah.
you forgot about the time.
That was something.
Whoa,
we
you'd
did.
have to scale some to get on somebody's lawn because the tide comes in and there's no way back.
We did used to love to climb the rocks.
Yeah.
The rocks were
Yeah.
very enticing.
Did they were they firing the artillery guns while you were there?
You know, I think they might have been back when I was in 7th and 8th grade.
I remember that
Yes.
because when they'd fire
Yes.
those, they would shake the whole place.
Yeah.
You
They
would feel it.
Not only shake that place, my dad grew
But-
up on Woodbury Street in South Portland, which is a mile away,
Yeah.
and his windows would rattle, and the china in the
Yeah.
china
Yeah.
closet would
Yeah.
rattle.
Right.
And they apparently, one of our other interviews said they had to publicize when they were going to
When they were
Oh,
going to-
sure.
fire so that
Right.
people could open their
Yeah.
windows.
Yep.
And
Yep.
Yeah.
yeah,
Those things, those
Yeah.
shells, they'd fire 15 miles out to sea.
Was this for practice?
yeah,
Yes. Oh, yeah. It was
they
just
had to
practice.
just in case.
They had targets that they pull out
Yeah.
Yeah.
on a
Yeah.
boat. They tow them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was the other thing folks were telling us about the chains they would put across?
Yeah.
Oh.
They did.
Yeah.
They had nets.
Submarine nets.
Oh,
Submarine
nets.
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 Yeah.
Yeah.
They were metal nets that they put
We're
across
going
the
to catch
channel.
a submarine in a net.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of fish, huh?
One of the things that I really remember was during the big fires down in Kennebunkport area.
Yeah.
And
That
was
47, yeah.
yes, and my father sent all of his troops down there to help fight the fires. We could smell the
You
smoke
could smell
was
it, yeah.
strong right
Yeah.
there at Fort Williams.
1947,
Yes.
47, yeah.
I got out of school to go fight the fires too.
Oh, did
Yeah.
you? Oh, good.
Carrying a bucket of water on your back.
Did you have one of those Indian
Indian tanks.
tanks? Yeah.
Sure.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yep.
That was, I think I was a junior or senior in high school.
Uh huh.
Were they recruiting people, or did you volunteer to go down and lend a hand?
Well, they asked.
I think
for
they were
volunteers
looking
to
for
go because,
volunteers. Yeah.
They really needed
fires were
this.
devastating. you know.
Yes, they were.
It's terrible.
What started that? Does anybody remember? I hadn't heard.
I don't remember what started
Oh,
the
some great
fires.
books
Do you?
about
There was a big article in the paper about the fires not too long ago, like a couple of years back, and it made me respond and send an editorial to the newspaper talking about what my father's role had been
Yeah.
in the fires, because they didn't mention any of that. But
One of the problems was that everything was so dry.
yeah,
Extremely
dry.
Then only a very small thing could spread like the devil.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
Some of my mother's relatives lost a home in the fires.
They've gotten
Some of my mother's relatives lost their home.
Yeah, my
house,
husband's relatives lost
Yeah.
theirs too.
Awful time.
and there was not a lot of vegetation down there for a lot of years.
No, there wasn't. You could drive down there
Right.
year after year, and it still
That's right.
looked just desolate.
Reading
Yeah.
about the history of our town, one of the major interactions between the fort and the town proper was at the time of fires. We had some of these coastal hotels.
Yeah.
Several of them, most of them burned down.
Yep.
But the fort invariably would send manpower to help
Right.
fight those fires. And this is back into the late 1800s.
Yeah.
the late what?
1800s.
18.
Yeah.
That's where
You didn't know he was that old, did you?
Some days I do.
Ways to go.
Now, from what I understand, there was no interaction between the Army and the Coast Guard at the lighthouse, right?
I didn't.
You
I
weren't
don't
aware of
remember
that?
any.
No,
Oh,
that's kind of.
But we all could have. You could go up. I used to go up in the lighthouse. You
Yeah.
could go up and you go way up top, and it was wonderful.
What
It was-
lighthouse?
How did you miss the
I
lighthouse?
don't know. I know there was a foghorn.
Oh,
I remember it.
And I can speak to the foghorn because I was the closest living to it. And you get so used to hearing the
Oh, yeah.
foghorn that you don't hear it.
We don't hear, but
It's one of those things people say, how can you stand living this close? And I say, you know what? We don't even know what's.
When you have house guests, you hear about it, though.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
but it had a different tone back
Yeah.
then, of course. They've changed it. It was
Yeah,
very
it
deep.
was.
And
It was.
it was lulling in a way because I
It
looked
was,
across the
You
street.
can still hear it every now and then in Falmouth. If the wind is blowing
Yeah,
right. Yep.
You know what's it's interesting that you said that though about not knowing that the lighthouse was there, because when you're a child, your perspective is so different.
There,
Yeah.
yeah.
Your eye level is in a totally different place,
Right.
and the stuff that really captures your imagination are more things like swimming pools
Mm-hmm.
and dams and
Oh yes,
Things in the
absolutely. Just Plus, it was far from where I would be. I would be at the officers' mess,
Which is way back.
it's near the road.
Yes, it is.
So,
And teaching you as a little girl, it probably felt like much farther away.
I don't think I walked in that direction. I think I walked down the hill because that's where, isn't that where the hot fudge sundaes were? Wasn't there a place where you could go in and get hot fudge sundaes and ice cream? And
Could be.
I think there was
Like a commissary?
I don't remember
like a
that.
commissary.
Oh, there is a commissary. Oh, there was a
yeah.
commissary. Yes.
Yeah. All the fun was down over the
Over the
hill. That's where
Yeah.
the movie theater was.
Yes.
That's where the parade grounds were.
Post exchange, at least for a while, was
Yeah, the
on
PX.
the same level as the Goddard, right?
Mhm.
No, it's
Yeah,
on the
PX.
hill,
That's
yeah.
where the ice cream would have been. The
Okay.
PX.
Yeah. Then there were other non-NCO quarters up on that level. And
Yes. They went from the Goddard Mansion. They went right
Down to the
back to the road.
down to the chapel. Yeah.
Were they segregated if you're on coast and you're in,
They are segregated.
Officers?
Very much so.
Was there a lot of-
yeah.
Oh,
there was
gosh, yes.
segregation.
There really is.
Class
Three
distinction.
levels.
There's
Yeah.
definitely in the service back then, there was huge class distinction.
yeah, you have to use the movie theater at different times.
No.
Were that?
No, it wasn't that.
Not there.
No,
It was just that there was not any real interaction.
Mostly knowing when to salute.
Social. No socializing between.
No social.
No, there
Really?
wasn't.
That's why my grandfather had an advantage. He was a civilian employee, so all soldiers were the
Right.
same with him.
Yep.
So he
Which is
treated the
nice.
officers maybe not as well as they were expecting, but they seemed to enjoy his sense of humor.
Oh, yeah.
And
We
the food
obviously
was
inherited
great.
that, yeah.
So
Music is one of my big interests, and you mentioned, touched on it earlier, parades and so forth.
yes.
How often would those be held?
Oh,
I mean,
I think we had frequent parades,
like
and you'd see them out
Sunday.
there marching on the
Yeah.
parade
parade
grounds.
ground, yeah.
and
Yeah.
down Shore Road too.
Yeah.
On special
Oh.
days, they would march down Shore.
I don't
Road.
remember them marching down Shore Road, but
Yeah.
because I had a vantage point right out my front
Yeah.
window.
Well, the band barracks
Huh.
were overlooking the pond.
Yes.
The band?
That's right.
On Barrett?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
This was its own little town.
It was its own little town.
It is.
need to go
It's a
anywhere.
small town.
If there's one thing that I want to come away with this, is that it was its own community.
It was
Had their
definitely.
own theater too.
Had everything, gymnasium, theater.
We you didn't really have to go anywhere except for school.
Yeah. You
And the
didn't
bus-
have to
and
go-
the bus did come on.
Was it the theater that burned down or
the chapel burned down.
the chapel?
Chapel.
Yeah.
The chapel burned.
Yeah.
Before we went to Germany, we were living across the street. We had to get our shots, and there were a lot of them to get back in 1946. And they were awful. They would make you sick. Your arm would be all swollen up, red, and we got them right here. We got them at the fort.
Yeah.
Okay.
The dispensary. They were at the doctors were at the dispensary, and if you got sick, you went in. That's where you went.
Right? There was
It was a clinic.
There was like there were beds in there if you were sick, if the soldiers were sick. But if if something really awful happened, I'm sure they'd send you into the.
more like an infirmary.
Yeah.
It was.
was.
It was.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Hope, have you been back?
Oh, we go. I mean, it's a haunt of ours. My grandchildren love to go. When my grandchildren, I have 2 sets of grandchildren that live away, and when they come to visit, we always go for a picnic at Fort Williams. Oh, it's always been. We visit probably 10 times in the summer. You know, it's just one of those to-go places.
Special place.
Let's go get an Italian sandwich and go out to Fort Williams.
Do you tell them your stories?
Of course, and you know what's interesting?
That's really special.
What's interesting is my husband went to Bowdoin, and he had his Bowdoin class had a tour of the Portland Harbor in the surrounds, and so we came out by Portland Headlight, of course, and so I was actually a tour guide for part of that trip to tell them about Fort Williams and what went on when I lived here. And they loved it, and it was because it's all personal stories, you know, and that's what's so fun. And my kids love it. And of course, every time we come out, different things come out about
Sure.
what happened when you live here, and I show them the steps that led up to the house that I used to live in. Now my 4 girls, all were able to go into the big house before it was torn down.
Mhm.
And I showed them because on the 3rd floor we had maids' quarters, and the closets had 2 opening doors, but they were sliders. And my brothers and I, or anybody, we'd play hide and seek. And you could go in one door of the closet, come out the other. And I mean, you can imagine the 3rd floor was okay. It wasn't off limits. And it was kind of a place where we tore around and
Yeah.
and had fun with our friends.
If I had the resources Donald Trump has, I would have that mansion restored.
Yeah, well, that's it. And that's been a
I was thinking about that when I was thinking about coming here today, and I pulled together a few pictures, and I thought, oh, that was such a beautiful place, and it's so sad to see it now. We always climb up on that now. We go up there and
And
climb
thank
all
Penny
around
Patience Carson for the
Yeah.
fact that it's there
Oh,
at all.
I know. Penny's
Right.
wonderful. Penny
Yeah.
was in one of my brother's classes.
Yep.
I've known Penny for years. This is something I pulled out. It's my father presenting an award to Mrs. Grant, who was queen of the Portland Harbor Defenses, and she was one of the Army dancers. Did you know about the Army
No.
dancers?
I thought there were only WACs. We dance.
We were Army dancers.